When billionaire tech mogul Sarah Williams erected a 10-foot fence around her mountain estate with a bold, "No Men Allowed" sign, the town of Cedar Ridge whispered. After her public divorce exposed years of betrayal, she'd sworn off the entire gender. But when a winter storm tears through her roof and every contractor in town refuses her calls due to her reputation, desperation forces her to accept help from the one man she can't pay, Jake Morrison, a widowed father of two who fixes roofs by day and hearts by accident. What starts as reluctant charity becomes something neither expected. A collision of two broken souls learning that sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very prisons that destroy us. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The sound started at 3 in the morning, a rhythmic dripping that Sarah Williams couldn't ignore. She lay in her king-sized bed, staring at the vaulted ceiling of her mountain estate, watching water collect in the corner where the beam met the wall. Each drop caught the moonlight before falling into the ceramic bowl she'd placed on the hardwood floor. Drip, drip, drip. She'd built this house to be perfect. Every detail curated, every angle calculated. The kind of place that made Architectural Digest photographers weep with envy. But perfection, she was learning, was as fragile as everything else. Sarah sat up, her silk pajamas cool against her skin. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Cedar Ridge spread below like scattered diamonds. Her estate perched on the mountainside like a fortress, which was exactly how she'd wanted it. 6 months ago, she'd had the fence installed, 10 feet high, wrought iron, with the sign that made the local newspaper, "No Men Allowed." The town had opinions about that sign. She'd seen the looks at the grocery store before she stopped going altogether. Heard the whispers at the gas station before she hired someone else to handle that too. Let them talk. After what Marcus had done, what all of them had done, she was done pretending to care about their judgment. Another drop hit the bowl with a soft ping. Sarah reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts. Richardson Construction. Blocked her calls after she'd refused to negotiate the price down. Summit Roofing. Same story. Denver, Sons. They'd actually hung up on her assistant. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. She was Sarah Williams. She'd built 3 companies from nothing, sold them for 8 figures each, and owned half the mountain. She didn't negotiate. She stated her terms, and people accepted them. Except now, apparently. The storm outside picked up, rain hammering against the windows with increasing fury. Another leak started near the fireplace, then another by the reading nook. Sarah grabbed more bowls from the Kit Williams, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. This was Marcus's fault. All of it. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, but the damage lingered like smoke in expensive fabric. 23 years of marriage reduced to legal documents and wire transfers. 23 years of believing in partnership, in building something together, only to discover he'd been building something else entirely. Multiple something else's, it turned out. With his secretary. With her personal trainer. With women whose names she'd never learned because the private investigator had stopped counting at 7. The final blow hadn't been the affairs. It had been the discovery that he'd been systematically moving their assets, positioning himself for the divorce he'd apparently been planning for 3 years, while still bringing her flowers every Friday. Still kissing her goodbye each morning. Still sharing her bed, and her dreams, and her trust. Men. They were all the same. Takers. Users. Liars who wore sincerity like expensive cologne. Sarah placed another bowl under a new leak and realized she was going to run out of containers. The phone rang. "Ma'am?" Her assistant's voice carried worry, even through the speaker. "I know it's late, but I've been making calls about the roof situation. I'm afraid I have some challenging news." "Tell me." "Every contractor within 50 miles has declined." "Some quite emphatically." Sarah closed her eyes. "What exactly did they say?" A pause. "Most cited scheduling conflicts. But ma'am, I think word has gotten around about your policies regarding male workers. And perhaps some of the disputes over pricing. These communities are tight-knit. The rain intensified, and Sarah heard what sounded like shingles hitting the deck outside. "Keep calling." "Expand the radius." "Ma'am, I've tried everyone within 100 miles. There's a storm system moving through the entire region. Every legitimate contractor is booked for weeks, even for emergency repairs." Sarah stared at the water collecting in her living room, her perfect sanctuary becoming a mockery of itself. "Then find illegitimate ones." I'm not sure what you mean." "Find someone, anyone. Post it online, put up flyers, ask around town. Someone has to be desperate enough for money to fix a roof." After hanging up, Sarah stood in her Kit Williams, surrounded by the sound of dripping water and the fury of wind against glass. The coffee maker displayed 3:47 a.m. in glowing blue digits. Outside, her motion lights illuminated the fence that surrounded her property, the sign barely visible through the rain. "No men allowed." She'd meant it when she'd put it up, every word. But standing here now, watching her perfect house fall apart around her, Sarah wondered if sometimes principles were luxuries she couldn't afford. The thought made her angry. At Marcus, at every contractor who'd hung up on her, at herself for even considering compromise. She'd built this life, brick by brick, decision by decision. She'd learned that trust was currency she couldn't afford to spend, that independence was the only security that couldn't be stripped away by someone else's lies. The fence wasn't just about keeping men out, it was about keeping control in. Another piece of her ceiling gave way, sending a stream of water across her imported Italian tile. Sarah Williams, who had conquered boardrooms and built empires, stared at the mess and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: helplessness. But only for a moment. She grabbed her laptop and started typing. If the mountain wouldn't come to Muhammad, then Muhammad would have to get creative. Someone in this God-forsaken town had to need money badly enough to ignore her reputation. Someone desperate enough to work for a woman they'd been told to avoid. Someone who didn't have the luxury of principles. Jake Morrison's alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. Same as every morning for the past 2 years. He reached across the empty bed to silence it, his hand automatically avoiding the space where Amy used to sleep. Some habits died harder than others. The house was quiet except for the storm outside and the soft breathing from down the hall where his kids slept. Emma, 8 years old and fierce as a wildcat. Tommy, 5, and still asking when Mommy was coming home. Jake had stopped trying to explain that home was where they were now, that Mommy lived in a different kind of place where rainstorms couldn't reach her. He made coffee in the Kit Williams that still bore Amy's touch the sunflower curtains she'd sewn by hand, the herb garden visible through the window she'd planted their first spring in the house. Everything here whispered her name, but selling felt like erasing her entirely. Some days he wasn't sure which would hurt more. The coffee was bitter. Jake had never learned to make it the way Amy did, with that perfect balance of strength and sweetness. He'd tried for 2 years, following her written instructions that he'd found tucked in the canister after the funeral. But some things couldn't be taught through recipes. His phone buzzed. A text from his brother. "Storm knocked down the Henderson's tree. Emergency job if you want it." Jake looked out at the rain battering his windows. Emergency jobs paid triple rate, but they also meant working in conditions that could kill you if you weren't careful. With 2 kids depending on him, careful had become his religion. But careful didn't pay Emma's school fees or Tommy's asthma medication or the mortgage on a house that felt too big and too small at the same time. He was reaching for his phone to text back when another message appeared. Unknown number. Urgent. Need roof repair immediately. Cash payment. Will pay above market rate. No agencies, no companies. Individual contractor only. Discretion required. Jake stared at the message. In 20 years of construction work, he'd never seen a job posting like that. Cash payment usually meant under-the-table work, which usually meant problems, but the words above market rate made him hesitate. Emma's school had sent another notice home yesterday. The private academy where Amy had insisted they enroll her was raising tuition again. Public school was an option, but Amy had fought so hard to get Emma in, had sacrificed so much to give their daughter advantages they'd never had. Switching schools felt like admitting defeat, like failing at the one job that mattered most. Another text came through. Address: 1247 Ridgeview Drive, the estate with the large fence. 500, just for assessment. Additional payment negotiable based on scope of work. Jake knew that address. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew that address. The Williams place. The woman with the sign, "No Men Allowed," he'd heard the stories. The divorce that had made regional news. The fence that had made local news. The contractors who'd been turned away. The battles over prices. The reputation that preceded her like storm clouds. But 500 for an assessment. That was more than he made some weeks. Jake looked at the photo on his refrigerator, Amy holding baby Tommy at the hospital, Emma grinning gap-toothed beside them. They'd been so happy then, so sure that love was enough to build a life on, before the cancer, before the medical bills, before learning that sometimes love wasn't armor against the world's sharp edges. He typed back, "Available this morning. What time?" The response came immediately. "As soon as possible. Back gate will be unlocked. Come alone." Jake finished his coffee, bitter as it was, and went to wake the kids. Mrs. Patterson next door would watch them. She'd been doing that more often lately. Seemed to understand that a single father sometimes had to take work when it came, even if it came from women with reputations and signs that made no sense. As he drove up the winding mountain road 40 minutes later, Jake tried not to think about what he was walking into. The estate loomed above him like something from a movie, all glass and stone and sharp angles that seemed designed to keep the world at bay. The sign was exactly as described. "No Men Allowed," bold letters on wrought iron that looked like it cost more than his truck. Jake sat in his driveway for a full minute, engine running, wipers fighting the rain. This was a mistake. Everything about this screamed complications he couldn't afford. But Emma's tuition was due in 2 weeks, and Tommy needed new shoes, and the mortgage wouldn't pay itself. Sometimes, being a father meant swallowing your pride and knocking on doors you'd rather walk away from. The back gate was unlocked, just as promised. Jake grabbed his tool bag and made a run for the house through the storm, his work boots splashing through puddles that reflected the lightning above. He was soaked by the time he reached the covered porch, water dripping from his hair and jacket. Through the glass doors, he could see into a living room that looked like a magazine, spread all clean lines and expensive furniture, and the kind of perfection that made him acutely aware of his muddy boots and working man's clothes. A woman appeared at the door. Not at all what he'd expected. Sarah Williams was smaller than he'd imagined, maybe 5'4" in her bare feet. She wore dark jeans and a cream sweater that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget, but she looked tired. Tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and without the armor of business attire he'd seen in newspaper photos, she looked almost vulnerable. Almost. Then she opened the door, and Jake saw her eyes. Sharp. Assessing. The eyes of someone who'd learned not to trust first impressions. "You came," she said, as if she hadn't quite believed he would. "You said you needed a roof fixed." She stepped aside to let him in, and Jake hesitated at the threshold. His boots were muddy, his jacket dripping. This wasn't the kind of place where people tracked in weather and work. "It's fine," she said, reading his hesitation. "The floor can be cleaned, the ceiling cannot." Jake stepped inside and immediately understood the urgency. Buckets and bowls were scattered throughout the living room, each one positioned under a different leak. The sound of dripping created an irregular rhythm that echoed off the high ceilings. "Started last night," Sarah said, following his gaze. "Got worse as the storm picked up." Jake set down his tool bag and looked up. The damage was extensive, multiple areas where water had found its way through what should have been a watertight seal. This wasn't a simple patch job. This was a full section replacement, maybe more. "I'll need to get up on the roof to assess the real damage," he said, "but from down here I can tell you it's not going to be cheap or quick." "How much?" The question was direct, businesslike. Jake named a figure that was fair but not low enough to cover materials, time, and the risk of working in storm conditions. Sarah nodded without hesitation. "When can you start?" That surprised him. Every other contractor in town had complained about her trying to negotiate down to unreasonable prices, but maybe desperation had changed her perspective. "I can start today, but I'll need to bring some help. This isn't a one-man job, especially in this weather." Her expression shifted immediately. "No." "Ma'am?" "No additional workers, just you." Jake looked at the damage again, calculating time and effort. "Ma'am, with respect, this is at least a 3-day job for a full crew. Working alone, in these conditions. I'll pay double." The words hung in the air between them. Double. That would cover Emma's tuition and Tommy's medication and give him a buffer he hadn't had since Amy died. But it also meant working alone on a dangerous job for a woman who clearly had issues with men in general. A woman whose reputation preceded her like a warning label. Jake thought about his children sleeping peacefully while he sat in this perfect house with its imperfect ceiling, talking to a woman who looked like she'd forgotten how to trust anyone, including herself. "Why?" he asked. "Why what? Why no other workers? Why the fence? Why the sign?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "That's not your concern. It is if I'm going to be working here for 3 days. My kids need their father to come home safe." Something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe, or recognition. "You have children. 2. 8 and 5. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the water dripping into her expensive bowls. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I don't trust easily, Mr. Morrison, Jake Morrison. I don't trust easily, Mr. Morrison. I've learned that trust is a luxury I can't afford. But my house is falling apart, and you're the only person who showed up." Jake studied her face, seeing something beneath the careful control. Hurt, maybe? The kind that ran deep and never quite healed. He thought about Amy, about the trust they'd built over 15 years of marriage. The way she'd looked at him even at the end, when the cancer had stolen almost everything else. Trust wasn't a luxury, it was the foundation everything else was built on. But Sarah Williams looked like someone whose foundation had been torn away, leaving her to build something new from whatever materials she could find. "Double pay, cash, job done right," Jake said finally. "But I work alone on my terms. I use the equipment I need, I take the breaks I need, and if the weather gets too dangerous, we stop until it's safe." "Agreed." She held out her hand for a shake. Jake noticed her fingers were steady, her grip firm, but her hand was cold despite the warmth of the house. "One more thing," she said as they shook. "No one else needs to know about this arrangement. Can you be discreet?" Jake nodded. In a town like Cedar Ridge, discretion was often the most valuable service you could provide. As he headed back out into the storm to retrieve his equipment, Jake caught sight of the sign again. "No men allowed." He wondered what had happened to make her believe that was necessary. What betrayal had been deep enough to make her wall herself off from half the world? But everyone had their reasons for the walls they built. His were just different from hers. The rain was getting worse, and Jake had work to do. By noon, Jake had been on Sarah's roof for 3 hours, and she'd been watching him for 2 hours and 57 minutes. Not intentionally. At least, that's what she told herself as she moved from window to window in her home office, laptop open to spreadsheets she wasn't reading, conference calls she wasn't fully present for. But every few minutes, her eyes drifted to the figure working methodically across her slate tiles, seemingly unbothered by the rain that had everyone else in Cedar Ridge hiding indoors. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from decades of experience, no wasted motion, no hesitation. Even from her third-floor window, she could see the careful way he tested each step, the systematic approach to removing damaged shingles. This wasn't someone cutting corners or rushing through a job for easy money. Marcus had never worked with his hands. In 23 years of marriage, she'd never seen him fix anything, build anything, create anything that wasn't made of numbers and promises. He'd hired people for that, contractors who arrived in expensive trucks, charged premium rates, and left behind work that looked perfect but fell apart the moment it was tested. like their marriage. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from her assistant. Board meeting moved to 2 p.m. Should I set up the conference room or would you prefer video from home? She glanced at the roof again. Jake was carefully lifting a damaged section, examining the underlayment beneath. His movements were precise, methodical, professional. Video from home, she typed back. And cancel my 4 p.m. I need to supervise some repairs. That wasn't entirely true. Jake Morrison didn't need supervision, that much was obvious. But something about having someone working on her property, someone she didn't know, made her feel unsettled in a way she couldn't quite name, or didn't want to name. At 12:30, she made coffee. Good coffee. The expensive kind she'd special ordered from a roastery in Seattle. Then she stood in her Kit Williams, staring at the full pot, realizing she'd made enough for 2 people. Force of habit. 23 years of marriage had programmed her to anticipate someone else's needs, to think in terms of we instead of I. Even now, 8 months after the divorce was finalized, she still sometimes set 2 places at the dinner table before catching herself. She poured 1 cup and put the rest away. Through the Kit Williams window, she could see Jake's truck in her driveway, a Ford that had seen better decades, rust eating at the wheel wells, a crack spider-webbing across the windshield. The bed was loaded with tools and materials, everything secured with bungee cords and worn tarps. It was the truck of someone who used it for work, not status. Marcus had driven a Tesla, then a Porsche. Then whatever his latest midlife crisis demanded, always leased, always new, always saying something about who he wanted people to think he was. Sarah found herself wondering what Jake Morrison wanted people to think, then stopped the thought. She didn't care. This was a business transaction, nothing more. He would fix her roof, she would pay him, and he would leave. Simple, clean. No complications. The doorbell rang. Sarah opened it to find Jake standing on her porch, soaked through despite his rain gear. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, maybe 40, maybe 42. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of weather and worry, but his hands were steady as he pulled off his work gloves. "I need to show you something," he said without preamble. "The damage is worse than it looked from inside." She followed him out into the rain, immediately regretting the decision as water soaked through her sweater. Jake led her around to the side of the house where a ladder extended to the roofline. "See this section here?" He pointed to an area where several shingles had been removed, exposing the wood beneath. "The problem isn't just the shingles. You've got rot in the decking, probably from a leak that's been slow and steady for months. Maybe longer." Sarah stared at the exposed wood, seeing the dark stains and soft spots that even her untrained eye could recognize as serious damage. "How much longer to fix it?" "That's the thing. I can patch this, get you through the storm, but it's going to happen again. The right way to do this is to replace the entire section, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet. New decking, new underlayment, new shingles." "How much?" Jake named a figure that made her blink. Not because it was too high she'd expected expensive, but because it was lower than what the other contractors had quoted for much smaller jobs. "That's all?" "That's fair," he said, studying her face. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Sarah tensed. "What?" "What did those other contractors quote you?" She told him. His expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like anger. "They were gouging you," he said flatly, "taking advantage because they thought you had more money than sense." "I do have more money than sense," Sarah said before she could stop herself. Jake was quiet for a moment, rain dripping from his hair. "No, ma'am, you don't. Someone with no sense wouldn't have built what you've built. Someone with no sense wouldn't be asking the right questions about the work." It was the first compliment anyone had paid her in months that wasn't about her portfolio or her business acumen. Something small and unexpected unfurled in her chest. "The work will take 4 days," Jake continued. "Maybe 5, depending on weather. I can start the structural repairs tomorrow, if the rain lets up. What about today?" "Today I make it watertight enough to get you through the storm. The pretty stuff comes later." Sarah nodded, then realized they were both standing in the rain, having a conversation that could have happened inside. But Jake didn't seem bothered by the weather, and somehow neither was she. "I should let you get back to work," she said. "Actually, I was wondering, is it all right if I use your bathroom? Been up there for 3 hours." The request was so normal, so human, that it caught her off guard. "Of course." Kit Williams' door, down the hall to the left. Jake disappeared inside, and Sarah stood alone in her rain-soaked yard looking up at her house. From this angle, she could see other areas where the roof looked worn, other potential problems waiting to reveal themselves. How long had she been living in a house that was slowly falling apart without noticing? How long had she been living in a marriage that was doing the same thing? When Jake emerged from the house, he paused on the porch. "Ma'am, that coffee smells really good." Sarah hesitated. Offering coffee meant conversation. Conversation meant interaction beyond the strictly professional. But he'd been working in the cold rain for hours, and she'd made a full pot. "Would you like some? You could take a break, warm up. I don't want to impose." "It's not an imposition." 5 minutes later, they sat at her Kit Williams Island. Jake's hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that looked almost delicate in his work, roughened fingers. He'd left his boots by the door and his wet jacket hanging on a chair, and without the armor of work gear, he looked less like a contractor and more like a person. "This is good coffee," he said after the first sip. "Thank you." They drank in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the rain against the windows and the steady drip of water into the bowls scattered throughout her living room. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said finally. Jake nodded. "Why did you come? When I texted this morning, every other contractor in town won't work for me." Jake considered this, turning the mug in his hands. "Because I need the work. Because my kids need things I can't afford to turn down good money. Because—" he paused. "Because everyone deserves to have their roof fixed, regardless of what people say about them. What do people say about me? That you're difficult. That you don't pay fair wages. That you hate men." He met her eyes. For what it's worth, 2 out of 3 seemed to be wrong. Despite herself, Sarah almost smiled. "Which 2? Well, you're paying me more than fair wages, and you made me coffee. That doesn't mean I don't hate men." "No," Jake agreed, "but it means you don't hate me. Yet." This time Sarah did smile, just a little. "Yet." Jake's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted softer, worried. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked. "My kids. They're home from school because of the storm. Neighbors watching them, but Emma, me daughter, she gets anxious when the weather's bad." "How old?" 8. Her mom died 2 years ago, and storms. They remind her of the night it happened. Thunder was really bad that night. The words hung in the Kit Williams air, heavy with grief that Sarah recognized. Not the same kind she carried, but grief nonetheless. The kind that changed the shape of everything that came after. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Thank you." Jake finished his coffee and stood. "I should get back to work. Want to get as much done as possible before the next wave of rain hits." Sarah watched him put his jacket back on, transform from the man who'd shared coffee and grief into the contractor who'd fix her roof. But something had shifted between them, some small barrier lowered. "Jake," she said as he reached for the door. He turned. "If you need to check on your kids, or if they need you to come home early, just say so. The roof can wait." For a moment he looked surprised, then grateful. "Thank you. But they're safe with Mrs. Patterson. And you need this fixed." After he left, Sarah returned to her office, but the spreadsheet seemed even less important than before. Through her window she could see Jake back on the roof, working steadily despite the wind that was picking up again. She found herself thinking about his children. 8 and 5, he'd said. Losing their mother so young. She wondered what that kind of loss did to a family, how a single father managed work and grief and the daily business of keeping children safe and loved. Marcus had never wanted children. Too expensive, he'd said. Too complicated. Now Sarah wondered if he'd simply known he wasn't capable of the kind of love that put someone else's needs first, every day for decades. Her phone rang. The board meeting she'd forgotten about. "Sarah, glad you could join us," came the voice of David Chang, her former business partner and current pain in her ass. "We need to discuss the Morrison account." Sarah's attention snapped into focus. Morrison? The acquisition target. Morrison Construction. Small outfit, but they've got contracts with 3 major developers. Problem is, the owner's been difficult to reach. Some kind of family situation. Sarah's blood went cold. What's the owner's name? Jake Morrison. Why? She looked out her window at the man on her roof, the man she'd just shared coffee with, the man who'd trusted her enough to mention his children's fears and his dead wife's memory, the man whose business she was about to buy out from under him. "Sarah? You still there?" "I'm here," she managed. "I need to review the files. Send me everything." "Already in your inbox. We're looking at a fairly aggressive timeline." "I need to go," Sarah said, and hung up. She stared at her computer screen, at the email that had arrived while she was making coffee and learning about thunder and grief. Morrison Construction. Financial analysis and acquisition strategy. Projected value. Potential obstacles. Market positioning post-acquisition. Jake Morrison wasn't just a contractor fixing her roof, he was a business owner struggling to keep his company afloat. A single father whose children needed stability. A man who'd looked her in the eye and called her fair, who'd thanked her for good coffee, who'd trusted her with pieces of his story, and she was going to destroy him. Sarah Williams, who had built her fortune on seeing opportunities others missed, on striking deals that benefited her bottom line, stared at the acquisition proposal and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Shame. Outside, the storm was getting worse. But inside, watching Jake Morrison work to save her house while she held the documents that would end his livelihood, Sarah realized some storms couldn't be fixed with new shingles and careful craftsmanship. Some storms lived inside you, in the space between who you were and who you'd had to become to survive. And some storms, once you let them in, never really ended. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed, listening to the storm rage outside and the steady rhythm of Jake's temporary patches holding against the wind. Every hour, she checked her phone for messages from David Chang, for updates on the Morrison Construction acquisition, for any excuse to call the whole thing off. None came. At 6 a.m., she gave up on sleep and made coffee. Through her Kit Williams window, she could see Jake's truck already in the driveway, though the man himself was nowhere visible. The storm had passed, leaving behind the kind of crisp mountain morning that made everything look washed clean and new, everything except the mess inside her head. Sarah had built her fortune on information, on knowing things other people didn't know, on seeing opportunities they missed, on acting decisively when others hesitated. But sitting in her Kit Williams with Jake Morrison's acquisition file spread across her granite countertops, she felt paralyzed by knowing too much. The numbers told a story she recognized. A small business stretched thin, contracts that paid slowly, while expenses came due monthly, equipment loans that required steady income to service. Morrison Construction wasn't failing, but it wasn't thriving either. One bad month, one major client backing out, one unexpected expense, and Jake would be forced to sell, or lose everything. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Morning, Miss O. Williams. Jake here. Starting work early if that's okay. Wanted to get the structural repairs done before more weather moves in." Sarah stared at the message. Polite. Professional. From a man who had no idea she was holding his financial future in her manicured hands, she texted back, "Of course. Let me know if you need anything." Then she gathered the acquisition files and locked them in her home safe, as if hiding the documents could make the knowledge disappear. By 9 o'clock, the sounds from her roof had taken on a different rhythm. Instead of the careful removal she'd heard yesterday, there was hammering now, the steady thump of reconstruction. Sarah found herself drawn to the windows again, watching Jake work with 2 other men she didn't recognize. Her stomach dropped. She grabbed her jacket and headed outside, her bare feet sliding into boots as she walked. Jake was standing near his truck, directing the other workers as they unloaded lumber and roofing materials. "Jake," she called out, her voice sharper than intended. He turned, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Embarrassment. "Ms. Williams, I can explain. You brought other workers. We agreed." "I know what we agreed." Jake stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But the structural damage is worse than I thought. Working alone, it would take me 2 weeks to do it right." And with more storms in the forecast, Sarah looked at the 2 men carrying lumber toward her house. Both wore worn work clothes and had the weathered look of career contractors. Both were clearly waiting to see if they'd be sent home. "I should have called first," Jake continued, "but I couldn't reach you this morning, and I wanted to get started before the weather turned again." Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger at being caught off guard, at having her explicit instructions ignored, at losing control of a situation she'd tried to manage carefully. But underneath the anger was something else. The realization that Jake had made the decision he thought was best for her, not for himself. "How much more?" she asked. "For the additional workers?" "Nothing. I'm paying them out of what you're paying me. They're friends, helping out." That stopped her short. "Why would you do that?" Jake was quiet for a moment, looking at her house, at the damage visible even from the ground. "Because you need it done right, and because—" he hesitated. "Because you trusted me to do this job when no one else would. I don't want to let you down." The words hit her like cold water. When was the last time someone had said they didn't want to let her down? When was the last time someone had made a decision based on what she needed rather than what they could get from her? "These are the only 2, Jake said. "Tom and Pete, they've worked with me for years. They're good people." Sarah looked at the men again. Tom was older, maybe 60, with graying hair and the kind of careful movements that spoke of a lifetime of physical work. Pete looked younger, clean-shaven, methodical in how he arranged the materials. Both men were watching the conversation with the patient wariness of people who'd worked for difficult clients before. "1 hour," Sarah said finally. "I'll give them 1 hour to prove they can work here without problems." Relief flickered across Jake's face. "Thank you." Sarah went back inside, but she couldn't concentrate on work. Every sound from the roof made her tense. Every voice raised above normal conversation volume made her wonder if she'd made a mistake. She'd spent 8 months building walls around herself, and now she had 3 men working literally on top of her sanctuary. But as the morning progressed, something unexpected happened. The work sounds became background noise, then something almost comforting. The rhythm of construction, the occasional laugh or friendly argument between the workers, the sense of people engaged in purposeful activity. It reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten: her father's garage. Sarah had been 12 when her father started his first business, repairing small electronics in the garage of their tiny apartment. She'd done homework at a folding table while he soldered circuit boards and replaced screens, the smell of flux and the sound of careful work becoming the soundtrack of her childhood. That garage had been the foundation of everything that came after the electronics store, the manufacturing company, the fortune that had allowed her to build this house on this mountain. Her father had never gotten to see the house. He died 3 years before she'd bought the land, but sometimes she wondered what he would have thought of his daughter's fortress of solitude, her careful isolation from the messy complications of trusting other people. At noon, her doorbell rang. Jake stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking uncertain. "Ms. Williams? I was wondering if I could use your Kit Williams sink. The outside spigot is frozen and we need to clean up before lunch." "Of course." She led him inside, hyper-aware of his presence in her space. Jake moved carefully, respectfully, taking off his boots without being asked, keeping his dirty work clothes away from her furniture. "The other men, Tom and Pete, they can use the sink too?" Jake paused. "If that's all right. I know you weren't expecting. It's fine." But when Tom and Pete came inside, Sarah felt her anxiety spike. 2 strangers in her house, muddy and tired and male. She retreated to her office, listening to their voices in her Kit Williams, the unfamiliar sound of multiple people in her space. 20 minutes later, Jake knocked on her office door. "We're done. Thank you for letting us use the sink." Sarah looked up from her laptop, where she'd been staring at the same spreadsheet cell for 15 minutes. "How's the work going?" "Good, really good. We should have the structural repairs finished today, weather permitting. Then tomorrow we can start on the finish work." "And your friends, Tom and Pete?" Jake's expression shifted, became more careful. "They're good workers, reliable. But if you're not comfortable, they seem professional." "They are. Tom's been in construction for 40 years. Pete just started his own business last year, but he's solid. Learned the trade from his grandfather." Sarah nodded, then found herself asking, "What did you tell them? About working here?" "That you needed a roof fixed and you were paying fair wages for good work, that's all. Nothing about the sign, the fence?" Jake met her eyes. "Your reasons for privacy are your business, Ms. Williams. Not theirs, not mine." The simple respect in his voice caught her off guard. How long had it been since someone had acknowledged her right to keep parts of herself private without demanding explanations? "Jake," she said, then stopped. She'd been about to ask about his business, about Morrison Construction, about whether he was struggling to keep it afloat, but the words wouldn't come. "Yes, ma'am?" "Nothing, just thank you for handling this professionally." After he left, Sarah sat in her office, staring at her phone. David Chang had called twice while she was talking to Jake, leaving voicemails about timeline expectations and market positioning. The acquisition was moving forward whether she participated actively or not. She thought about Jake's truck, about the rust and the cracked windshield, and the careful way he'd secured his tools. She thought about his children, about an 8-year-old girl who was afraid of storms because they reminded her of the night her mother died. She thought about Tom, 40 years in construction, probably looking forward to retirement if he could save enough. About Pete, just starting his own business, trying to build something that would last, all of them depending on Morrison Construction for work. All of them about to lose their livelihood to a spreadsheet and a board meeting. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing an email to David Chang, then deleted it. Started again. Deleted it again. Outside, the sounds of construction continued, steady, purposeful. The sound of people building something instead of tearing it down. At 4 o'clock, Jake knocked on her door again. "We're finishing up for the day. Wanted to show you what we got done." Sarah followed him outside and immediately saw the difference. Where yesterday there had been visible damage and emergency patches, now there was new wood, clean lines, the beginning of proper repair. "This section here," Jake pointed to a large area of fresh decking. "That's all new, solid, should last 20 years, maybe more. It looks good. Tom did most of this work. He's got an eye for structural integrity that comes from decades of experience." Sarah looked at the careful craftsmanship, the precise cuts and seamless joints. Where did he learn to work like this? His father, who learned from his father. 3 generations of carpenters. Pete's the same family trade, family businesses, generational knowledge passed down from father to son. The kind of continuity Sarah had never had, never thought she wanted. The kind of continuity her acquisition would destroy. "Jake," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. Is business good? Morrison Construction?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding how much truth to share. "It's been better, but we're managing." "Why?" "Just wondering. You seem to have good people working for you. The best. Tom and Pete. Couple others. We take care of each other." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to say more. As Jake loaded his tools and prepared to leave, she stood in her driveway watching 3 men who had no idea their lives were about to change. Tom waved goodbye as he climbed into his truck. Pete called out, "See you tomorrow, Ms. Williams," with the kind of casual friendliness that suggested he'd already forgotten about her reputation. Jake paused at his truck door. "Ms. Williams, I want to thank you again for giving us a chance today. I know having additional workers wasn't what you wanted. They did good work. They did. And they respect your privacy. You don't have to worry about that." After they left, Sarah stood alone in her driveway as shadows lengthened across her property. The work sounds were gone, replaced by the evening quiet of mountains and wind through trees. Her phone buzzed. David Chang, again. Sarah, need your sign-off on the Morrison timeline. Board meeting tomorrow at 2 p.m. to finalize acquisition strategy. Your input critical for success. Sarah stared at the message, then at her house where 3 men had spent the day rebuilding something that had been broken. Tomorrow, she would sit in a conference room and discuss the strategic value of destroying Jake Morrison's business. She would talk about market positioning and asset acquisition and the inevitable logic of consolidation. She would do it because it was good business, because it was what she'd built her career on, because backing out now would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. But tonight, she would sit in her Kit Williams and listen to the silence where work sounds had been, and wonder when she'd become the kind of person who could share coffee with someone while planning their destruction. The answer, she realized, was simple. She'd become that person the day she decided that survival was more important than connection, the day she chose safety over trust, the day she put up a fence around her heart and told herself it was protection, not prison. But some prisons, once you recognize them, became harder to live in. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m., but Sarah arrived at the Morrison construction office at 11 a.m. She'd spent the morning lying awake, then pacing her house, then driving aimlessly through Cedar Ridge until she found herself pulling into the gravel lot of a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building looked like it had seen better decades-faded brick, windows that needed washing, a hand-painted sign that was weathered but still readable. Morrison Construction. Family-owned. Since 1987. Jake's truck wasn't there yet, but Tom's was. And Pete's. Through the large bay doors, she could see equipment and materials organized with the kind of careful efficiency that spoke of people who couldn't afford waste. Sarah sat in her car for 20 minutes, engine running, trying to convince herself to leave. This was a mistake. Showing up unannounced, inserting herself into Jake's workspace, crossing professional boundaries she'd established for good reasons. But she couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at her house yesterday, the pride in his voice when he'd talked about Tom's craftsmanship and Pete's dedication, the way he'd said, "We take care of each other," as if it was the most natural thing in the world. When had she stopped believing that people could take care of each other? Jake's truck pulled into the lot at 11:30. Sarah watched him park, gather his coffee and paperwork, head toward the office door. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd started his day early and knew exactly what needed to be accomplished. She got out of her car before she could lose her nerve. "Ms. Williams?" Jake stopped halfway to the door, surprise clear on his face. "Is everything all right? Problems with the roof?" "No problems. I wanted to see your operation, if that's okay." Jake studied her face, and she could see him trying to read her motivations. "Of course. Though it's not much to look at." He led her through the bay doors into a space that was organized chaos. Tools hanging on pegboard walls, blueprints spread across work tables, the smell of sawdust and motor oil and decades of honest work. It was nothing like her sterile corporate offices, nothing like the glass and steel environments where she conducted business. It reminded her of her father's garage. "Tom, Pete," Jake called out. "Williams is here." Both men looked up from a blueprint they'd been studying, surprise flickering across their faces before settling into the polite wariness she'd seen yesterday. "Williams," Tom nodded. "Good to see you again. Everything okay with the roof work?" Pete asked. "Everything's fine. I just wanted to understand the business better, the people I'm working with." Jake gestured toward his office, a glass-walled space in the corner of the warehouse. "Would you like some coffee? It's not as good as yours, but it's hot." Sarah followed him into the office, taking in the details that told the story of Morrison Construction. Family photos on the desk, Jake with 2 children, all 3 of them laughing. A woman with kind eyes who must have been his wife. Awards from the Chamber of Commerce, Better Business Bureau, Local Contractors Association. Financial documents scattered across the desk, invoices and estimates and payment schedules. Jake poured coffee from a pot that had seen better years, handed her a mug with the company logo. "So, what can I tell you about our operation?" Sarah sipped the coffee. He was right. It wasn't as good as Herson tried to find words for what she was doing here. "How long have you been in business?" "Took over from my dad in 2015. He started the company in '87, built it from nothing. One truck, a few tools, a lot of determination. And now? Now we've got 4 full-time employees, dozen or so part-timers we call in for bigger jobs. We handle everything from residential repairs to commercial construction. Nothing huge, but steady work." Sarah looked out through the glass wall at Tom and Pete, still bent over their blueprints. They seemed dedicated. "They are. Tom's been with us since my dad's time. Pete's newer, but he's got the instincts. Good people are hard to find in this business. And if something happened to Morrison Construction, if you had to sell or close?" Jake's expression shifted, became more guarded. "Why would you ask that?" Sarah felt the weight of the acquisition documents in her briefcase, the 2 p.m. meeting that was approaching whether she attended or not. Just curious about the challenges small businesses face. Well, Tom's close to retirement, but he can't afford to stop working. His wife's been sick, medical bills. Pete just bought a house, first-time homeowner, counting on steady employment to make his mortgage payments. The other guys, they've got families, responsibilities. If Morrison Construction disappeared tomorrow, it wouldn't just affect me. Jake leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Ms. Williams, can I ask you something?" Sarah nodded, though her heart was beating faster. "What do you do? For work, I mean." "I know you're successful, obviously." He gestured vaguely in the direction of her mountain estate. "But what's your business?" This was it. The moment where she could tell him the truth, explain about Williams Industries and acquisition strategies and the board meeting that would determine his future. The moment where she could give him a chance to fight back, or at least prepare. "Technology consulting," she heard herself say. "Helping companies optimize their operations." It wasn't exactly a lie. Williams Industries did own several tech consulting firms. But it wasn't the truth either, and Jake deserved the truth. That must be interesting work. It can be, though sometimes you have to make decisions that affect people's lives in ways they don't expect. Jake nodded. "I imagine that's hard, having that kind of responsibility." Sarah looked at him, this man who was worried about Tom's medical bills and Pete's mortgage, who'd brought friends to help with her roof repair and paid them out of his own fee, who spoke about responsibility as if it was something you carried for others, not something you wielded over them. "Jake," she said, then stopped. "Yes? If someone wanted to buy Morrison Construction, would you sell?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake was very still, his coffee mug halfway to his lips. That's a strange question to ask. Hypothetically. Hypothetically. Jake set down his mug, looked out at his employees, at the business his father had built and he'd inherited. "I'd have to think about what was best for everyone, not just me. And what would be best? Depends on the buyer. Depends on what they wanted to do with the company, with the people. If someone wanted to buy us just to shut us down, eliminate competition, fire everyone and sell the equipment." Jake shook his head. "That wouldn't be best for anyone except the buyer." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. That was exactly what Williams Industries would do. Acquire Morrison Construction, absorb their contracts, eliminate redundancy, sell the assets. Standard business practice. Efficient. Profitable. Devastating. But if the right buyer came along, Jake continued, someone who understood what we've built here, who wanted to help us grow instead of just consuming us, that might be different. You think there are buyers like that? I have to believe there are. Otherwise, what's the point of building anything? Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from David Chang. Conference room ready. Acquisition documents finalized. See you at 2. She stared at the message, then at Jake, who was looking at his own phone with a frown. Problem? She asked. Emma's school. She's in the nurse's office, says her stomach hurts. Might need to pick her up early. The 8-year-old? The one who's afraid of storms? Jake looked surprised that she'd remembered. Yeah, she gets anxious sometimes, especially when I'm working somewhere new. She worries I won't come home. The simple honesty of a father whose child worried about losing him, who made decisions based on what was best for everyone instead of just himself, hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stood abruptly. I should go, let you get back to work. Miss Williams, wait. Jake stood too. Is everything all right? You seem upset. Sarah looked at this man who'd fixed her roof and made her coffee and worried about his employees and his daughter. This man whose life she was about to destroy for the sake of market positioning and quarterly returns. Jake, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. If someone told you that your business was in danger, that someone was planning to hurt you and your employees, what would you do? Jake's expression grew serious. I'd want to know who and why, and if there was anything I could do to protect my people. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Miss Williams, if you know something, I have to go, she said, and left before he could finish the question. Sarah drove back to her house in a haze, her mind spinning between the board meeting in 2 hours and the look on Jake's face when he talked about protecting his people. She sat in her Kit Williams, staring at her phone, at the acquisition documents spread across her table. At 1:45, David Chang called. Sarah, where are you? We're about to start. I'm not coming. What? Sarah, this is a major acquisition. We need your sign-off. Then proceed without it. We can't. Your stake in Williams Industries means we need your approval for acquisitions over $5 million. You know that. Sarah closed her eyes. She did know that. She'd structured it that way specifically to maintain control over major decisions. Sarah, what's going on? This isn't like you. Maybe that's the problem. Look, if you're having second thoughts about the Morrison deal, we can discuss terms. But backing out entirely doesn't make business sense. This is a solid acquisition. For who? For us. For our shareholders. For our bottom line. And for Morrison Construction? For their employees? Silence on the other end of the line. Sarah, David said carefully, since when do you care about the target company's employees? That's not how business works. He was right. That wasn't how business worked. It wasn't how she'd built her fortune or her reputation. It wasn't how she'd survived Marcus's betrayal or built walls high enough to keep the world from hurting her again. But sitting in her Kit Williams, looking out at the roof that Jake Morrison had fixed with his own hands, Sarah realized that some ways of doing business came at costs she was no longer willing to pay. David, I'm withdrawing my support for the Morrison acquisition. Sarah, you can't be serious. We've put months of work into this. I'm completely serious. This is about more than business, isn't it? Jesus, Sarah, please tell me you're not personally involved with this Morrison guy. Sarah thought about the question. Was she personally involved? She'd shared coffee with him, learned about his children, watched him work with care and precision on her house. She'd seen him make decisions based on what was right rather than what was profitable. Yes, she said finally, I suppose I am personally involved. Sarah? She hung up. For a long moment, Sarah sat in the silence of her Kit Williams, realizing what she'd just done. She'd walked away from a profitable deal, alienated her business partners, acted on emotion instead of logic. She'd chosen connection over control. The phone started ringing again. David, probably, or other board members who'd gotten word of her decision. Sarah turned it off and walked to her window, looking out at the mountain landscape that had been her refuge for so long. Tomorrow Jake would finish her roof. He'd pack up his tools and his careful craftsmanship and drive away, not knowing how close he'd come to losing everything, not knowing that a woman who'd sworn off trusting men had chosen to trust him instead. Sarah Williams, who had built her life on information and control and the careful management of risk, had just made the most dangerous decision of all. She'd chosen to care about someone else's well-being more than her own profit. And for the first time in years, she felt something that had nothing to do with business success or financial security. She felt hope. Jake arrived the next morning to find Sarah waiting on her porch with 2 cups of coffee and an expression he couldn't quite read. "Morning," he said, accepting the cup she offered. The coffee was perfect the way she'd made it that first day, with that careful balance he'd noticed but hadn't mentioned. "Morning. How's Emma?" Jake paused, surprised she'd asked. "Better. Turned out she wasn't really sick, just worried. She does that sometimes when I'm working somewhere new." "Worried about what?" "That something will happen to me, that I won't come home." Jake sipped his coffee, looking out at the mountain view that still took his breath away even after 3 days of working here. After her mom died, she got it in her head that people she loves just disappear sometimes. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "That's a heavy burden for an 8-year-old. "Yeah, we're working on it. Therapy helps, but mostly she just needs consistency. Needs to know I'll be there when I say I will." "And you always are?" "I try to be. It's the most important part of the job, being her dad." They stood in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and watching the morning light move across the valley below. Jake found himself wondering about Sarah Williams' life, about what it was like to live in this beautiful isolation, to have built something so impressive and so solitary. "Jake," Sarah said finally, "can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "Do you ever think about remarrying, giving Emma and Tommy a mother?" The question caught him off guard. It was more personal than anything she'd asked before, and there was something in her voice, no curiosity, exactly, but something deeper. "I think about it sometimes," he said honestly. "The kids ask about it occasionally, but—" He paused, trying to find the right words. "Amy, was it for me, you know? We met in high school, got married at 22, had 15 years together before the cancer. I'm not sure I know how to love someone new. But you're not opposed to the idea?" Jake studied her face, wondering where this was coming from. "I'm not opposed to it, but it would have to be someone who understood that Emma and Tommy come first, always. Someone who could love them, not just tolerate them. That seems reasonable." "What about you?" Jake asked. "Ever think about trying again? Marriage, I mean." Sarah's expression shifted, became more guarded. "I was married for 23 years. That was enough." "Bad divorce?" "The worst kind. The kind where you discover the person you trusted most in the world was systematically betraying you for years." Jake winced. "I'm sorry. That's a special kind of hell." It was. But it taught me something important. You can't trust someone just because you love them. You can't assume good intentions just because someone says the right words. That's a lonely way to live. Sarah looked at him sharply, as if he'd said something unexpected. "It's a safe way to live." Sometimes those are the same thing. They finished their coffee in silence, and Jake went to work. Tom and Pete arrived shortly after, and the 3 of them settled into the rhythm of finished work, the careful installation of new shingles, the precise sealing of joints, the attention to detail that would keep Sarah's house dry for decades to come. But Jake found his mind wandering to their conversation, to the sadness in Sarah's voice when she'd talked about trust and betrayal. He'd seen that look before, in clients who'd been burned by contractors, in friends who'd gone through bitter divorces. The look of someone who'd decided that walls were safer than bridges. Around noon, Jake's phone rang. Emma's school again. "Mr. Morrison, this is Principal Hayes." "Emma's fine, but she's asking to speak with you. She says it's important." Jake stepped away from his work, concerned. "Put her on." "Daddy?" Emma's voice was small, worried. "Hey, sweetheart, what's wrong? Are you coming home today?" "Of course I'm coming home. I come home every day. But you're at the scary lady's house." Jake glanced towards Sarah's Kit Williams window, wondering if she could hear the conversation. "She's not scary, Em. She's just private. Tommy says she hates kids. Tommy doesn't know what he's talking about. She doesn't hate kids. But the sign says no boys allowed, and Tommy's a boy." Jake smiled despite himself. "The sign says no men allowed, and Tommy's not a man yet. He's got a few years." Emma giggled, and Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Daddy?" "Yeah? Will you bring me something from the scary lady's house? Like a rock or something? So I know you were really there, and you're really coming home? The request was so earnest, so rooted in an 8-year-old's logic, that Jake felt his heart squeeze. I'll see what I can do, kiddo. After he hung up, Jake stood looking at Sarah's property, trying to see it through his daughter's eyes. The high fence, the imposing sign, the isolation, it probably did seem scary to a child, but he'd seen something else here over the past 3 days. Loneliness, maybe? The kind of careful protection that came from being hurt badly enough to wall yourself off from the world. Everything okay? Tom asked, walking over. Yeah. Emma being 8. Tom nodded knowingly. My granddaughter's about that age. World seems like a big, scary place when you're small. Yeah. Jake looked at the house again. Tom, what do you think of Miss Williams? Honestly, I think she's lonely as hell. Rich as sin, but lonely as hell. What makes you say that? Been watching her watch us work. She's at those windows constantly, like she's hungry for the sound of people doing things. And that Kit Williams of hers saw it when I used the bathroom yesterday. It's set up for 1 person, but there's signs everywhere that it used to be set up for 2. She's got a dining table that seats 8, but there's only 1 chair that looks used. Jake had noticed the same things but hadn't put them together quite that way. Also, Tom continued, she made us lunch yesterday. Sandwiches and soup, really good stuff. But when Pete thanked her for it, she looked surprised. Like she wasn't used to being thanked. Maybe she's just not used to having workers around. Maybe. Or maybe she's not used to having anyone around. That afternoon, as they finished the final details of the roof repair, Jake found himself thinking about Emma's request and Tom's observations. When Sarah appeared on the deck below, checking on their progress, he made a decision. Ms. Williams, he called down. Could I ask you a favor? She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. What kind of favor? This is going to sound strange, but my daughter asked me to bring her something from your house, like a rock or something. She has anxiety about me working in new places. And she thinks if she has something from here, it proves I was really here and I'm really coming home. Sarah was quiet for so long that Jake wondered if he'd overstepped. Then she said, How old is she again? 8. And she's worried about you? She worries about everyone she loves. It's how she deals with losing her mom. Sarah disappeared inside, and Jake went back to work, wondering if he'd made her uncomfortable. But 15 minutes later, she reappeared carrying a small box. Would this work? She asked, holding it up. Jake climbed down from the roof to see what she was offering. Inside the box was a smooth piece of quartz, about the size of a golf ball, with veins of gold running through it. I found it when I was having the foundation dug, Sarah explained. The contractor said it was probably worth keeping, but I never knew what to do with it. Jake picked up the stone, feeling its weight, admiring the way the gold caught the light. This is beautiful, but it looks valuable. I can't. It's not valuable to me sitting in a box. But if it helps an 8-year-old girl worry less about her father, then it becomes the most valuable thing in my house. The simple generosity of it, the understanding behind it, caught Jake off guard. Thank you, she'll love it. What's her name again? Emma. Emma. Sarah repeated the name as if testing how it sounded. Does she look like you? Everyone says she looks like her mom, but she's got my stubborn streak. And the boy, Tommy? He's all me, unfortunately. Same cowlick, same tendency to get into trouble. Sarah smiled, the first real smile Jake had seen from her. They're lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have them. As Jake and his crew packed up their tools, Sarah stood on her deck watching the process with something that looked like reluctance. The work was done. The roof was solid, properly sealed, built to last. Tomorrow, these men would drive away, and her house would return to its careful silence. Miss Williams, Jake said, approaching with the final invoice. Here's the accounting, materials, labor, timeline. Sarah glanced at the numbers without really reading them. It looks fair. It is fair. You hired good work and you got it. She signed the check, her movements automatic, professional. But when she handed it back, she didn't immediately let go. Jake, she said, can I ask you something? Of course. If someone had tried to hurt your business, tried to buy you out and shut you down, but then changed their mind at the last minute, would that make them a good person or just someone who got lucky? The question was so specific, so loaded with something Jake couldn't identify, that he paused in surprise. I guess it would depend on why they changed their mind, he said finally. If they realized they were about to hurt people and decided that mattered more than whatever they were trying to gain, then yeah, that would make them a good person. Even if they were the one who set the whole thing in motion to begin with? Everyone makes mistakes. The measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, it's what they do when they realize they've made one. Sarah nodded, looking out at the mountain landscape that surrounded her property. That's generous. It's practical. We all mess up. The alternative is believing people can't change, can't choose to do better. That's a pretty hopeless way to live. As Jake loaded his truck and prepared to leave, Sarah found herself reluctant to say goodbye. The past 4 days had been the most human contact she'd had since the divorce, the most normal she'd felt in months. "Jake," she called as he reached his truck. He turned. "If you ever need additional work, bigger contracts, someone to refer you to other clients, I know people. In the construction industry, in development, I could make some calls." Jake studied her face, as if trying to read what she wasn't saying. "That's generous, but why would you do that?" "Because you do good work, because you deserve success. And," Sarah hesitated, then decided on honesty, "and because I've spent the last 8 months believing that all men are selfish and untrustworthy." "You've reminded me that might not be true." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Miss Williams, I hope you find someone worth trusting again. You deserve that." As he drove away, Sarah stood in her driveway watching his taillights disappear down the mountain road. The house behind her was solid now, protected, built to withstand whatever storms might come. But standing there in the gathering dusk, Sarah realized that sometimes the strongest structures were the ones that let people in, not the ones that kept them out. She looked at the sign on her fence, "No men allowed," and made a decision. The next morning, Sarah called a contractor to remove the fence. All of it. The wrought iron, the imposing height, the signs that had kept the world at bay for 8 months. She kept one thing, the small piece of quartz that Jake had shown his daughter, with its veins of gold running through ordinary stone. She placed it on her Kit Williams windowsill, where the morning light would catch it, where it would remind her that sometimes the most valuable things were the ones you gave away. 3 weeks later, Jake Morrison received a call from a development company in Denver. They'd heard about Morrison Construction from a mutual contact, were interested in discussing a long-term partnership for a major residential project. The kind of contract that could change everything for his small business. When Jake asked who had recommended them, the developer mentioned a consulting firm called Williams Industries. Jake smiled, remembering coffee and a perfect Kit Williams, and the way Sarah Williams had looked when she'd chosen to trust him with her roof. Some repairs, he thought, went deeper than shingles and structural damage. Some repairs were about learning to trust again, one conversation at a time. In her house on the mountain, with sunlight streaming through windows no longer hidden behind barriers, Sarah Williams made coffee for one and found herself hoping that someday she might need to make enough for 2, or maybe even 4. If an 8-year-old girl and her 5-year-old brother ever came to visit the woman who'd given their father a chance when no one else would, the woman who'd learned that the strongest walls weren't the ones that kept people out, but the ones that kept love safe once you'd decided to let it in,